Hi, everyone, and welcome to our third and final week of your Exam 2 content. This week, we're going to cover learning and decision making, but I also want to draw your attention to the information that you need to be successful next week during your second exam. So first, the key issue is to be aware that your second exam is coming. As with the first exam, it'll become available first thing Monday morning of next week, and it'll be available through 5 p.m. on Friday. That means that you have to submit the entire completed exam by 5 p.m., not start the exam by 5 p.m. As with last time, you'll have 2 hours to complete it. That 2 hours has to happen in one single block of time. You'll have 3 short answer questions that you have to answer. I'll give you 4 total. You can either choose not to answer the 4th question of whichever one you choose not to answer, or you can answer it for 5 points of extra credit. It's totally up to you how you handle it, if you only want to answer 3 or if you want to answer all 4. Then, as with last time as well, there's a key terms list in your Exam 2 module tab. And underneath this, you'll see sort of the reading summarized that we've done for Exam 2. You'll see all of the key terms, key points, key learning objectives. And I would again encourage you to access that early, use it often in the process of studying, treat it as a study guide. I treat it as comprehensive and hopefully as a way for you to check what you do know, what you don't know, what you need to revisit from the lectures and so on, or maybe as a way to organize your notes as you move through the lectures on the front end. So please make use of the resources that you have available. Please think about the extra credit if you're not as happy with your grade on the first exam. And definitely let me know if you have any questions about what to expect from this course next week. All right, with all of that being said, we're going to dive into our content for this week, which is learning and decision making. We are again still in the phase of the course where we're talking about all of the ways that we get from sort of the individual factors that you bring to the table to these key outcomes that we care about, which again are job attitudes and job behaviors. And one of the sort of intermediating variables here is learning and decision making. Who you are matters for how you learn and how you make decisions at work. And this is really key for shaping those organizational behaviors and attitudes that we care so much about. So this week, we're really going to dedicate ourselves to talking about this process and talking about how we make decisions, how we best make decisions, and maybe some optimal, some suboptimal ways that we make decisions, and so on. But just to define our learning objectives or our agenda for today, we're going to start by defining learning. And learning is not really talked about in your book chapter, but I think it's a really important component of what happens on the job. And it's certainly related to decision making because there's a lot of learning that happens in context, and that helps us inform our future decisions. And we learn from the decisions that we make, and hopefully we make better decisions in the future because of that. And then we'll talk about some methods of learning in organizations, and some of these methods are familiar to us. We've already talked about them, and some of them will be a little bit new, but I don't think any of them are particularly complicated. They're all probably pretty intuitive. Then we'll get into the heart of what your book focuses on, which is decision making. And here we'll talk about different types of decision making. We'll talk about sort of pitfalls in decision making and what leads to faulty decision making, which unfortunately is very common in all forms of decisions that we make, but certainly within organizations as well. All right, so as I said, we're going to start with learning. And again, this isn't well covered in your book, so you really only have the slides to go on, and I'm going to be mindful of that. But I also don't want to do a deep dive on learning, right? This isn't sort of a cognitive psychology course, and there's lots that we could get into. So I'm going to keep this pretty high level so that we just have a basic understanding of how learning happens and some models for how employees might learn from their behavior on the job. All right, so first I want to define learning, and here we refer to learning as permanent changes in an employee's knowledge or skill that result from experience. And the key here is that we expect learning to be long lasting, right? We expect that if you learn something today on the job, such as you go to a training and that covers certain content, that you're going to retain that information for a long period of time and be able to apply that to future tasks that you do on the job, future decisions that you have to make on the job. And it's not this sort of temporary, I learned it in the moment. Sorry, my cat wants to say hi. This is Scooby. So it's not this sort of temporary, I learned it in the moment and I had it in my brain for a week or a day or something like that, but it's something that's a little bit more long lasting. And then I also want to differentiate between what we refer to as explicit knowledge, which is a form of knowledge that we can learn, and then tacit knowledge, which is a different type of knowledge that we can learn. So explicit knowledge is sort of something that you see represented in the workplace in an explicit way, and you learn it through some sort of formal process. So for example, if you have learned something in Excel because you went to a training or because somebody told you that information, that's explicit learning or explicit knowledge. Then there's tacit knowledge, and tacit knowledge is something that we learn through sort of picking up on informal cues. So if you're in a workplace and you learn that a certain person doesn't like to be addressed in a certain way, but that person never told you that. You've just noticed that they react negatively when they're referred to in that way, or they react positively when they're referred to in a different way. That's tacit knowledge. So it's the stuff that we don't talk about, that we don't formalize, but we still learn through observation or through these different cues in our workplace. And what we find is this sort of tacit knowledge, this implicit knowledge, is really important for navigating organizations. And oftentimes we don't really recognize that there's a ton of tacit knowledge that needs to be learned, right? So we forget that we're not sort of explicitly telling people about the informal rules of our organization. But really the difference here is explicit is something that someone tells to you directly, and tacit is something that you learn on your own, right? Without that ever being made into a formal conversation. All right, so now I want to talk about some theories of how people learn. And our first theory is a theory that we should all know very well because this was covered in your motivation chapter or the last chapter that we talked about. And this is reinforcement theory. Again, the idea behind reinforcement theory is that there's a stimulus, response, reward pairing, and if you do certain behaviors and those behaviors are met with something positive, right, they're met with some sort of reinforcement, then you're going to continue to do those behaviors. And if you do a behavior and it's met with something negative, some sort of punishment or something is taken away from you that you want, then that's going to, lead you to not engage in those behaviors anymore. And here we have some different terms, and this is organized a little bit differently, but I think if you're, still tripped up by these terms, definitely revisit the motivation lecture. But basically, there are times that we can add something, right? We can give someone something after they engage in a behavior, and that includes positive reinforcement, which is where we give someone something they want, right? We give them a promotion because they've engaged in good behavior, or we can add a negative consequence, which is punishment, right? So I'm going to do something like yell at you if you do something wrong, right? That would be punishment. Then we have this second column in our matrix, which is where a consequence is removed. We're taking something away. If we take away something that somebody wants, so they engage in bad behavior, so we say, actually, that promotion that I promised you, it's gone. I'm not going to give it to you anymore. That's extinction. And then we also have negative reinforcement, and this is where you're removing an unwanted outcome. So because you did something positive, you don't have to stay late like you were going to have to finish a project, right? I'm going to take away that unwanted outcome from you so that you continue to engage in that behavior. So again, the idea here is that we learn to do the things that are reinforced, that are rewarded, and we learn not to engage in the behaviors that are punished or have this extinction, right? And this is, again, a pretty reflexive process where we just respond to our environment in these predictable ways, and it's not necessarily a process in which we're super engaged in the learning experience, right? So that's certainly a criticism that we talked about with motivation, and that still applies here as well. All right, then another big way that we learn is through observation. And we talked about this a little bit already when we talked about that tacit knowledge, right? There's a lot that we learn simply by observing what other people do in the workplace. And this isn't necessarily completely separate from reinforcement theory, because we're not only going to look to what people are doing, but we're also going to look to what's rewarded and what's punished when other people engage in those behaviors. So some of the reinforcement processes are still at play here, but this is adding the piece that it's not necessarily about us, right? It's not always our behavior and what's rewarded and punished, but it's also about watching other people. So if we go through this process, we have an attentional process, and this is where you sort of pick a role model to pay attention to, right? So maybe you pick somebody who's really successful, or maybe you pick somebody who, has the same job as you and has been there longer than you, but you're going to pick a role model, someone that you're going to observe, and you're going to focus your attention on that person, right? It takes active, conscious attention to learn through observation. Then we have this retention process. It's not just enough that we've paid attention to this role model, but now we also have to remember the behaviors. We have to encode that information so that we can recall the behaviors that person engaged in, even when they're not there and even when they're not engaging in those behaviors in front of us. Then we have this production process, which is where we reproduce what we've seen, right? And here it requires that we have the KSAOs that are necessary to be able to reproduce the behavior. If we see somebody engage in some sort of acrobatics, right, we can't just learn through observation if we don't have the skill to be able to do the same behavior. And then finally, there's the reinforcement piece. As I said, this isn't wholly separate from reinforcement theory, but ideally we would have the learner experience some sort of reinforcement for engaging in that behavior, right? So we look to behaviors that are rewarded for other people, and then those behaviors are reinforced for us when we also get the same rewards, right? So we have to replicate the behavior, but then it also has to be positively reinforced or rewarded for us to continue to engage in it. All right, so those are some theories on how we learn, but I think we also know that people don't always come to learning for the same reason or with the same goal, right? And here people have differentiated between some different goal orientations or some different motivations for why people want to learn or how they tend to learn in an environment like training where you've sort of forced them into new content. Here we have 3 different goal orientations, and as we'll talk about, these different goal orientations are more or less positive for things like learning and performance. The first goal orientation is what we call learning goal orientation. If you have a learning goal orientation, when you're in an experience where you're learning something new, you're in a new environment, your goal is to develop, right? So folks who have a high score on learning goal orientation truly just want to become better people, right? They're interested in growth, so they're really open to these new learning contexts because they think that learning is going to, create them to be a better person. Then our second goal orientation is what we call a performance prove goal orientation. And this is sort of exactly what it sounds like. The entire goal here is to prove your competence to other people. You want to prove to others that you can do it, right? So if you're in a learning environment like a training context and you're basically just trying to kind of show off, right? You're just showing outwardly your mastery or your competence, then that's performance prove goal orientation. Then our final goal orientation is what we call performance avoid goal orientation. And this is where you want to avoid failure, right? So it has to do with competence. It's still sort of about saving face, but instead of wanting to show off mastery, you simply want to avoid any context that might lead to failure. As you can probably imagine from hearing the description of these different goal orientations, learning goal orientation is the best case scenario. It means that people are really open to the learning process. It means that they're willing to engage in challenging types of learning, even if they're not going to be good at it the first time, even if it's a risk of failure, they're still interested in engaging in that type of learning simply because it leads to growth or it leads to development. Then performance avoid goal orientation is the worst for learning and performance because these folks tend to really avoid challenges and they basically don't want to do anything that exceeds their skill set because that, leads to a risk of failure. And if you're in training or you're in a context where you're supposed to learn and you don't want to do anything that exceeds your current skill set, that's not going to lead to you actually mastering the new content. So learning goal orientation is the best case scenario for both learning and performance. Performance prove goal is the sort of middle ground, and then performance avoid goal orientation is the worst case. In class, we would have actually spent some time going through these items to figure out what type of goal orientation you have. But if you're curious, you can go through and rate these different items on the extent to which you agree or disagree with them. So how true of yourself are these items? 1 is strongly disagree, 5 is strongly agree. And the first 4 here are the avoid goal orientation. The next set of items, 5 through 8, are prove goal orientation. And then the final 5 items here are that learning goal orientation. So if you want, you can pause here, maybe take a minute, look through this, see which one you score higher on. And it's possible that you can score high on more than one, right? We can really like growth, but also like to demonstrate our competence. That's totally possible. But we tend to think of, the avoid goal orientation as being pretty counter to the other 2. So you can look at your pattern here and see, what type of learner are you? What brings you to learning? Okay, as I said, we're going to keep learning kind of very quick and dirty today because it's not in your textbook and I don't want to do a deep dive, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a foundation before we get into decision making. But really the heart of what we're talking about today is decision making, and we'll spend more time here than with learning, although again, I'm trying to keep our content a little short today. So again, just like with learning, I want to start off by defining exactly what decision making is. And decision making, I'm sure, is something we're all very familiar with. And it's really just this process of making choices among alternative courses of action. And in some ways, this is how we define motivation, right? If we think about Vroom's theory, by theory, it was also about selecting among different alternative actions that one could take. But here, this is about choosing a course of action rather than choosing a task to devote effort to. Then the reason why decision making is so important and something that I think we should spend time on in this particular course is because data indicate that organizational decisions fail quite frequently. And in fact, more than half of decisions made in organizations tend to be what we would consider to be faulty decisions, or they're decisions that are suboptimal, they cost us money, they cost us time, or they lead to us having to kind of backtrack and redo things with a different path, right? And there are a ton of different reasons why we make these faulty decisions. And that's kind of the crux of what we're talking about today. So I want to go through some different ways that we make decisions, some different sort of types of decision-making models. And then we're going to talk a lot about these different biases that lead to faulty decisions. And hopefully through the 2 assignments, the application question and the in-class assignment, you can kind of reflect on when your own decision-making might have been faulty or when these different biases might have affected you. Okay. So again, we're going to start with some types of decisions. And the first distinction that I want to make in types of decisions is the difference between a programmed decision and a non-programmed decision. Program decisions are routine decisions, and they're things that we face all the time. So for example, if you're a manager, you might hire people all the time, right? Every time a position's open, you're responsible for filling that position. That would be a program decision because it's routine. And we tend to have an automated response, meaning we approach that decision in the same way every time. And that sort of approach, that automated response that we've created, is what we call a decision rule. A decision rule is sort of an if X, then Y kind of rule that we create for ourselves, where if I'm presented with having to select someone out of a group of candidates, my decision rule is that I'll always pick the person with the highest cognitive ability score, right? It's just a set rule that we apply to the same type of decision every time so that it becomes cognitively a lot easier to make the decision, right? Instead of attending to each decision and saying, what's the right way to approach this decision? What are the alternative ways that I could make the decision? What are the different criteria I could evaluate? You just say, okay, if I'm faced with this kind of decision, this is the type of rule that I'm going to apply. And then it takes me less time, it takes me less cognitive effort to make that choice. Then we also have non-program decisions, and these are essentially the opposite of program decisions. These are the unique, infrequent decisions that pop up, right? So maybe we hire people all the time, but we don't often have to discipline somebody, and we might have to make a decision on a unique sort of disciplinary case where someone's engaged in bad behavior, and maybe we've only done that a couple times in our career, or this is a very unique type of bad behavior that we haven't seen before, right? That's a non-programmed decision. And here, instead of just having this automated response where we say, if X, then Y, I have this decision rule, we have to engage in careful cognitive deliberation. So these decisions are slower, they're cognitively more taxing, more draining to make, and they're thankfully things that we don't have to decide on all the time, right? So that's sort of the difference here. Program decisions, they happen all the time. We make quick decisions because we've done it all the time and we have this decision rule. And non-program decisions are things that we face infrequently, and they tend to take a lot of cognitive effort to resolve. All right, then we have different levels of decisions. And here we're really talking about where in the organization is this decision taking place. At our very highest level, we have strategic decisions. Strategic decisions are happening in C-suite. They're happening in top management. So our CEO, our COO, our CFO, someone who's at the top level of the organization, making decisions about what the organization should do, right? How should the entire org function? Some examples of a strategic decision that are listed here are things like, should we merge with another company, right? Should we pursue a new product line? So if we have a tech company and they make phones and they're deciding whether or not they also want to create a tablet, right? Making that decision of whether they're going to enter into a new marketplace is a strategic decision, and it's made again at the highest level of the organization. Then we have tactical decisions, and tactical decisions are sort of at the middle of the organization. So these aren't top executives, but they are leaders, they are managers, and they affect other people at lower rungs of the organization. And here our tactical decisions are more about how to execute the strategic decisions, right? So these all sort of fall in sequence with one another. We might make the strategic decision that we want to create a new product and enter into a new marketplace. Then the managers, the leaders in the organization have to make some tactical decisions about how they're going to do that, right? How are they going to market the new product? How are they going to be successful in that new marketplace? Those decisions, again, come from the middle of the organization. Then we have our final level of decision making, which is operational decisions. And operational decisions happen sort of at the bottom rungs of the organization. It's the everyday employee who has to make these decisions. But again, they also align with the decisions that are made above them. So they're going to fall from the strategic decisions And here again, we have a strategic decision that's whether or not we're going to make this new product. Maybe we decide, yes, we are going to make the new product. Tactical decisions are things like how do we market that new product? And then our operational decisions, the decisions of everyday employees, would be things like, how can I best communicate this new product line, this new marketing strategy to my current customers? If I'm interacting with a customer who already has a big account for something else, should I mention that we're creating this new product? That would be an operational decision. What I really want to sort of emphasize here is that all of these decisions matter. Obviously, our strategic decisions are these really grand decisions about how the entire organization is going to function. And if we make a faulty decision at this level, it has a really, really big impact. And that impact is really apparent, right? If we say, yes, we're going to make this new product, and then that product fails, that can really jeopardize the company. But these decisions also don't happen that often, right? So yes, they have really high impact when they occur, but they're not that frequent. Then if we go all the way down to the bottom with operational decisions, employees make a ton of decisions every day. They tend to be less consequential, right? What one individual employee does on a given day isn't going to be as impactful for the organization as these big strategic decisions, but they happen all the time. Every employee makes multiple, maybe even many decisions in any given workday. So the sort of cumulative impact of these operational decisions can be just as large as the impact of strategic decisions or tactical decisions. Okay, now that we know these different types of decisions that we can make, these programmed and non-programmed and the decisions at different levels, I want to talk about some models of decision making. And these are really more about the cognitive process that people assume we engage in when we have to make a decision or when we're presented with a decision, regardless of whether it's programmed and we're creating that decision rule or if it's non-programmed or what level of the hierarchy we're at. So our first model is called the rational decision-making model. And this model is very similar to a lot of those person as scientist theories of motivation that we talked about, which is they assume that humans are inherently rational and perfectly rational, meaning that people are going to sit down with any decision that they have to make. They're going to engage in formal cognitive deliberation, and they're going to sort of use every piece of information at their disposal to arrive at the optimum decision, regardless of how much time that takes, regardless of how much energy that takes. We're all motivated to use all of the information to arrive at the best decision. And here we have a process, right? A formal process through which a rational decision should be made. The first part of the process, what really spurs the process, is that we identify that there's some sort of problem, right? That there is a decision that needs to be made. Then we're going to establish the decision criteria, right? What would a solution need to fit to be a good solution, right? What are sort of the things that I have to have in a solution to be able to fix this problem? Then I'm going to weigh those decision criteria to see which ones are really needed, make sure that I have all of the decision criteria, which ones are the most important, and so on. Then I'm going to get to the phase of creating the alternatives, right? So what are the potential solutions that meet potentially this decision criteria? Then in stage 5, I'm going to evaluate those alternatives. So I'm going to sit down, I'm going to engage with those alternatives that I've created, and I'm going to see which one fits the decision criteria the best, right? This is really where I figure out which of those decisions is the best, is the optimal decision, right? Then I arrive at that decision in 6. I've selected my choice from all of the alternatives. 7, I'm going to implement it. So I'm going to actually take that solution. I'm going to engage with it to solve the problem. And then in 8, I'm going to look for evidence to see how that decision worked, right? Did it solve the problem? Did it make it worse? Did it solve part of the problem, but not all of the problem, right? How did this decision actually go? And then, of course, that information is going to feed back into the process. So if I were ever presented with a similar situation, the idea is that all of this process, and especially the evaluation component, is going to inform those future decisions. We probably know, just like with those motivation theories that say we can reduce motivation down to a formula, that people are not this rational, right? I think we can use this as kind of a gold standard of how decisions should be made. But we also know that people don't necessarily make decisions in this way. And that's for lots of reasons, right? They could not have all of the information that they need. They could misidentify not what the problem is, but maybe where it's coming from. So they might misunderstand what a solution needs to be successful. People may not have time, right? This is a very timely, very costly process. And if you're a CEO and you have 20 fires that you have to put out a day, you may not have the time to be able to sit down and go through this process. So because we know that people don't always engage in this, I want to introduce a couple other models here that help us understand how people might make decisions. The second model here is what I'm going to call good enough decisions. And this is the bounded rationality model. So our previous model here, oh, it won't let me go back. Okay. Our previous model was the rational decision-making model. And this is our bounded rationality model. And this is maybe more honest, right, about the limitations of human decision-making. The previous model, again, says we're always going to invest the effort if we can and we have the information to create our optimal decision, right? We want to arrive at the best decision, so we're going to engage in this formal logic process to get there. The bounded rationality model says that there are many limitations of human decision-making, and we're not going to assume that people sit there and carefully weigh out every single alternative course of action that they could take, right? Instead, what they're going to do is create that decision rule. They're going to identify the problem. They're going to figure out what would it take for a solution to be successful. And then they're basically just going to search until they find one acceptable decision, right? Until they find the first thing that fits their decision criteria, their decision rules, the first thing that could solve the problem, and then they're going to run with it. They're not going to generate alternatives. They're not going to figure out which of those alternatives is the best thing to do. They're just going to find something that immediately puts out the fire. And again, here, I've called this good enough decisions because it's not about making the best choice. It's not about finding the best solution. It's about coming to a decision as quickly as possible to put out the fire as quickly as possible, right? And here, the goal I've written is to satisfice. And satisfice, again, is to just find the bare minimum acceptable decision to move forward. Okay, so that's kind of the middle point, right? We started with people are completely rational. They're motivated to make the absolute best decision that they possibly could. Then we sort of went to the bounded rationality model, which is people want to make good decisions, but they're limited in their capacity to make perfect decisions. So they're still going to engage in some cognitive process, right? They're still going to engage in some deliberation, but they're just going to deliberate until they find one feasible solution. Our third model takes a very different approach, and this is the intuitive decision-making model. And basically what this model says is that it's not about rational decision-making. It's not about this cognitive deliberation. It's not about seeking data or trying to figure out, what the best course of action is out of a set of actions. And instead, we're going to solely rely on our intuition. We're going to go with that gut feeling. We're going to maybe rely on our previous experience a little bit, right? The last time I did something like this, it worked fine as far as I know, so I'm just going to go with it. Or, this was the first thing that came to me. It's kind of my knee-jerk reaction, so I'm going to run with it. We're, again, not engaging in that formal logic process. There's no assumption here of any form of rationality or even, the assumption that we're trying to come up with a good solution. We're just going to come up with a solution that seems to make intuitive sense to us. As you can imagine, intuitive decision making is far more likely to fail, but unfortunately, a lot of people think that they're making good decisions when they rely on this intuitive process. This is extremely common among managers and among my friends who are, practicing in the OB space and they work with managers. The most common issue that they run into is they say, here's what the science says you should do. And managers say, I don't care about the science. I know how to do it, right? I just get a gut feeling that this is the right person to hire. And that's how I know. And that's how I make all of my decisions. And every person thinks, yeah, okay, the data show that intuitive decision making isn't that great, but I'm the one who's different, right? That applies to other people because they're bad decision makers, but I'm not a bad decision maker. My gut feelings really do lead me in the right direction. So unfortunately, this is not a very good method of making decisions, but it is a very common method of making decisions. And I also want to note that this is more likely to occur under strained conditions, right? If you think about our previous models, they require a lot of time. They require a lot of effort. The rational model more so than bounded rationality, but even the bounded model requires that we sit down and engage in some deliberation. Sometimes we just simply don't have the capacity to do that. And when we don't have that capacity, when we're really stressed, when we're dealing with a ton of other decisions, that's when we tend to make these snap intuitive decisions. So part of what we can do in organizations as leaders is make sure that people have the resources that they need, the time, the capacity to be able to make better decisions. Otherwise, we run the risk of people making these intuitive decisions instead. Okay, our final type of decision making is sort of completely separate from our previous three, right? So we can kind of organize our previous three from most rational to the least rational, or having the most cognitive deliberation to the least cognitive deliberation. Here we're going to take a step outside of that and talk about a different method of making decisions, and that's creative decision making. This isn't less rational. It's not, we can't rank it in that way. But instead, this is really about capturing a unique decision-making process that happens in a space where we have completely novel problems and we need completely novel solutions. With all of our previous decisions, we're sort of assuming that we have some information about available solutions, right? We have some information about the things that we could do and how successful they might be, because we have to compare them to each other and we have to compare them to our decision rules. Here, with a creative decision, we assume none of that. We assume that we are in completely uncharted territory and that we are facing a problem for which we have never found a solution before, right? Maybe because we've never ever had to search for a solution for this particular type of problem. So here we have to generate completely new, completely imaginative ideas. We have another formal process through which creative decision-making happens, but this looks pretty different, right? So we're going to start at the same place. We have to recognize that there's a problem that requires a solution. But then instead of creating these decision rules, we're going to move to what's called immersion. This is where we are going to learn as much about the problem as we possibly can, right? Then in step 3, this is incubation. And in incubation, this is where we're sort of sitting here, we're waiting for this aha moment to come to us, right? So we're going to immerse ourselves in the problem. We're going to learn as much as we possibly can. And then we're going to sort of take a step back and let all of that information incubate in our brain, right? So that we aren't coming to just this knee-jerk reaction. Then step 4 is illumination. Illumination is when we actually get that aha moment. This is when the solution just comes to us and we feel, like we can move forward and we can do something about this problem finally. And then step 5 looks a little bit more like our previous model. This is where we're going to verify and apply the decision or apply the solution to the problem. So here, again, the most important piece is sort of giving yourself time to process all of this information and coming up with that novel solution. Okay, with all of this in mind, I wanted to talk through a little bit about when we should engage in each of these types of decisions. Creative decisions are necessary. They happen sometimes within organizations. They're very costly, very time intensive, but they don't happen frequently, right? So that's the good thing. Then, of course, rational decisions, as we said, are kind of the gold standard, but we don't always have time, and the decision isn't always big enough to warrant spending that amount of time. So sometimes bounded rationality can sort of get us through. And then our intuitive model, the book says that there are some times that you should use it or can use it. I, as a scientist, am a little more cautious about saying that we should rely on intuitive decision making, but sometimes we can at least draw on experience, right? So to go through these, rational decisions are, again, the best used when the decision is really important. So if we're making a big strategic decision or making some sort of decision that has high consequences, we could lose a lot of money, we could have to fire people, right? Something really bad could happen if this doesn't go right. Then that's when we want to sit down and devote the effort and time to that full rational decision-making process. This is also really a time where we have to have clear alternatives that are present, and we have to know something about how those alternatives function, right? We have to be able to say, these are a set of options and they do or do not meet these decision criteria. Then bounded rationality is maybe a better option when we have lower stakes decisions and the minimum criteria are clear, right? So again, we're looking for a solution that satisfies us. We're looking for a good enough decision. So we need to know what the minimum criteria of a good decision is, right? What is the minimum acceptable criteria for this solution to fix the problem? And here, this isn't a time, again, where we have these really high stakes decisions. So we're not trying to maximize an outcome. We're not trying to create the best decision. We're just trying to get by. Then you can use intuitive decision making if you have unclear goals, if you have really high time pressure, so there's something happening and you have to make a decision right now, right? You simply do not have the time to deliberate. And if you have a lot of experience with similar types of problems, right? So if we're in that sort of, this is a routinized decision, this is a program decision, we've done it before, we have some decision rules, then here we can make more of an intuitive decision. Then we would make creative decisions when, again, there's no clear solution. We have a problem that we've never encountered before. We're searching for solutions we've never implemented before. So we have to come up with something that's completely novel. But again, this requires time. So we have to be able to have that time to immerse yourself in the issue, right? And really, in these cases, there's no way around that time commitment. You could engage in the creative process until you hit just a good enough idea, but it still requires more time than if we were making this bounded rationality decision for something else where we already knew what solutions were available. Okay, so now that we've run through pretty quickly some of these different types of decisions and these different decision-making models, I want to talk about faulty decision-making. And I want to talk about really what can go wrong in decision-making. Obviously, we've sort of grounded this in the fact that most organizational decisions are faulty, right? I told you roughly 50%, a little bit more than 50% of organizational decisions fail, meaning they cost money, they're the suboptimal decision. And there are some predictable cognitive processes, or what we would call cognitive biases, that lead us to make bad choices. So we're going to give some names to each of those biases. The first is overconfidence bias. People tend to feel like their skills and abilities are higher than they are. So if we're presented with a decision, we're presented with a problem that we have to solve, we oftentimes feel more equipped to make that decision, or maybe more informed about making that decision than we actually are. And this overconfidence bias can happen in a few different ways. So first, there's overestimation. This is where we estimate our performance is better than it is. So again, we're going to think that we're really skilled or could perform really well on solving this task, and maybe we can't. The second is over-precision, and this is where we have excess confidence in our knowledge. So if we think we're super informed, we've read as much as we possibly could about anything related to this decision, and there's nothing else that we're missing, there's no information that we don't have access to, that's over-precision. And then a really common form of overconfidence bias is overplacement. And this is overrating yourself compared to others, right? So you've probably seen studies where people ask, do you think you have above average intelligence? And statistically, only 50% of people can be above average. But what we find is way more than 50% of people think that they are above average, right? So they're overrating their self as compared to others. And in particular, people who are lower in intelligence are more likely to overrate themselves, overplace themselves. So people are not good at recognizing their failings, right? They're not necessarily good at recognizing their performance isn't what it needs to be to make this decision. There's knowledge that they're missing, or even recognizing that maybe there's someone better suited for making this decision than they are. Then we have hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is really, boils down to that phrase, hindsight is 20/20. When we look back on things, it seems obvious, and we often think that we could have predicted what outcome actually occurred. And here, this is, let's say we've made a decision and it went catastrophically wrong, right? We would think in retrospect, right? Wow, I should have seen that mistake coming. It's so obvious that this was not the right solution. It's so obvious that it was going to lead to these negative consequences, when in fact it wasn't obvious to us then, and it really isn't obvious to us now, other than it happened, right? That's the only reason it seems obvious. This can certainly affect our own decision making, right? Where we look back and we think, oh, I should have known that this was not the right decision to make. But in particular, it makes us really poor judges of other people's decisions, because we think, again, in hindsight, where we have all the information, we know what decision's been made and we know what consequences occurred from that decision, we think if I was the one to make that decision, I never would have put us in this position because I would have seen this negative outcome coming. So here, this is a little bit like overconfidence, where it's going to make us overconfident that we would have made a better decision than someone else. And we might, if we're rating somebody who made a poor decision, think, wow, that should have been so obvious to you, even though it wouldn't have been obvious to us. Then we have anchoring. And this is a tendency for people to rely too heavily on a single piece of information. Or the way I like to think about anchoring is it's getting stuck at a starting point. So if I were to say something like, do you think the number of people who make poor decisions is higher or lower than 30%? You would answer differently than if I said, do you think the number of people who make poor decisions is higher or lower than 80%, right? We get fixated on where we started, and then we don't sort of accurately adjust from there. We get anchored to 30% or anchored to 80%, and we think, okay, it's a small adjustment from wherever we started. And unfortunately, when making decisions, this means we can get anchored with whatever decision we come up with first, or we can get anchored with a single piece of information about the problem, where we think, okay, this is the most important aspect of the problem, so the solution has to fix this piece of the problem more than anything else, even though that's not true, right? Just because we learned it first doesn't mean that it's the most important. Then we have escalation of commitment. And this is also called the sunken cost fallacy. And I think this is something that we probably deal with all the time. And it's essentially people overcommit to a particular course of action simply because they've already committed to it. So if I make a decision X and then I'm implementing it and there are some signs along the way that it's going to fail, I'm still going to keep on with that decision and maybe even double down on that decision because I feel like I've come too far to go back, right? I don't want to admit failure. Maybe I've invested time, I've invested money, I've invested resources, and I feel like I can't go back to the drawing board. I can't come up with a new solution. So I have to just move forward with this particular decision, even if indicators seem to suggest that it's not going to be successful. This, I think, is probably the easiest one to avoid, right? Because we can just recognize that we're doing it in the moment, recognize that, we haven't come too far, maybe we have come pretty far, but going further means that we're going to lose more time and more money. Then, of course, we also have limited information bias. It isn't a cognitive bias in the same way as the other ones, which is we tend to think in certain ways or we have certain cognitive shortcuts. But this is where we just simply don't have the information that we need to be able to make the best decision. And here, right, this really relates to the rational model versus bounded rationality, where with the rational decision-making model, we need to have all possible information, right? And with bounded rationality, it's saying we need to just kind of come up with the first solution that presents itself that's pretty decent. But of course, if we're coming up with just the first solution, then that's going to lead to limited information because we haven't engaged in this full cognitive process that's needed to really vet all of our ideas and make sure that we have all possible solutions on the table. So when we have limited information or, we maybe have some information, but we're not actually applying it because we're not going through this formal logical process, then we're more likely to engage in poor decision making. And this chart here is really focused on when bounded rationality can fail because of this limited decision making. With a rational decision making process, we would think through all aspects of the problem, whereas with bounded rationality, we sort of tend to boil it down to something that we can fix or easily understand. Then with rational decision making, we develop that exhaustive list of all possible alternatives, whereas with bounded rationality, we might come up with just one straightforward solution that solves the problem. Then with rational decision making, we should evaluate all of those alternatives and evaluate them against one another. Whereas with bounded rationality, we're just going to sort of evaluate, is this one good enough? And as soon as one has the check mark, we're just going to move forward. With rational decision making, this is really the key for information, is we want to make sure we use all information available to evaluate that alternative. And then with bounded rationality, we tend to sort of distort the information to fit the one solution that we've picked. And then, of course, the overarching goal of rational decision making is to pick the alternative that maximizes value, maximizes whatever outcome it is we want. And with bounded rationality, we aren't doing that, right? We're picking something that just satisfies us. Okay, so now that we know how people make decisions and we know a lot about how decision making can go wrong, I want to talk through a little bit about what we do with this in organizations, right? How do we actually encourage learning and encourage learning that's going to create better decision making? And typically what organizations do is training, right? The most common way that organizations tackle learning, or maybe they recognize that there's a decision-making problem and some learning is necessary to overcome that decision-making problem, is to implement a training. We spend tons and tons of hours as employees in training every year. And the training literature is complex, right? We could certainly have an entire class on training. And some of it says that training works, but it tends to work for short-term outcomes, and it tends to work for things like knowledge more than it does for behavior. What I mean by that is we can go to a training and we might learn something, right? But we may not actually change our behavior on the job. And that's where this next point comes in, which is climate for transfer. We refer to anytime someone learns something in training and then changes their behavior on the job in response to that learning as transfer of training, right? We're transferring what we learned in training to our job context. We have to make sure that we have a climate in the organization, in our work group, whatever, that allows for transfer, that encourages transfer, right? So for instance, if we have a culture or a climate that says, we don't like to do new things, right? We're afraid of new ideas. We think there's one good way to do certain tasks on the job. That's not very conducive to implementing new knowledge learned from training, right? So first we want to train people, then we want to make sure that we have this climate that allows them to transfer what they learned in training to the actual job. Then we can also encourage learning through behavioral modeling, right? If we think about learning through observation, which is one of the theories that we talked about, behavioral modeling is really important. And here we want to think about who people are going to look to for their role models, right? So high-level leaders, the leader or supervisor that you have the most contact with, that's who you're going to look to. So we want to make sure that they're well-trained and they know the behaviors to engage in to role model that for their employees. And here I like to think about this in the context of stress and health, right? We tend to say things like, oh, we care about work-life balance, we care about the well-being of our employees. But if we see our leader sending emails after hours, working 80-hour weeks, never taking time off when they're sick, not taking time off for their kids, their family, what are we actually modeling to our employees, right? So we want to think about how we can use our leaders as change agents, how we can use them to demonstrate better behavior that we want our employees to engage in. And then, of course, we can also have communities of practice, and communities of practice it's really a different context of training where we're still trying to learn something within a group. We're trying to bolster some sort of knowledge or skill or ability, but we're doing it in these small groups that tend to persist for a long period of time, right? So training is 1 hour, 1 day, one workshop. Communities of practice might persist for 6 months or a year or even longer than that, where we're trying to build these skills within an environment where we can see it modeled by other people, where we have support, and we have that continued touch point where people can continue to learn over time.